In the shadow of the Great Pyramids, beneath layers of sand and forgotten centuries, lies a truth that would shake the very foundations of everything we thought we knew about ancient Egypt. What if I told you that the most powerful civilization in human history wasn't founded by a pharaoh at all, but by a serpent goddess whose name has been deliberately erased from the stories we've been told? Tonight, we're diving into one of archaeology's most suppressed discoveries, a goddess so powerful that her very existence threatened to rewrite history books, a divine feminine force that predates the pharaohs by thousands of years, and a conspiracy of silence that has kept her legacy buried for over 3,000 years. What we're about to uncover will challenge everything you think you know about the birth of civilization itself. The serpent coiled around the pharaoh's crown wasn't just decoration. It was a reminder of who really held the power, and those who knew the truth spent centuries trying to make us forget. This is the hidden history of Wadjet, the Green One, the serpent goddess who founded Egypt and whose legacy they tried to bury forever. Long before the first pharaoh ever set foot on a throne, before the Great Pyramids pierced the desert sky, before hieroglyphs told the stories of kings and conquest, there was Wadjet. Her name means the papyrus-colored one, derived from the ancient Egyptian word for green, the color of life itself emerging from the fertile Nile Delta. But Wadjet was far more than just a goddess of vegetation. She was the primordial force that shaped a civilization. Picture this. Around 4,000 years before Christ walked the earth, the Nile Delta was a vast expanse of marshland, papyrus reeds swaying in the wind, and serpents gliding through the waterways. It was here, in this primordial landscape, that Wadjet first emerged from the depths of creation itself. The ancient texts tell us she created the first papyrus plant, the very foundation of Egyptian writing and knowledge. She didn't just witness the birth of civilization, she orchestrated it. But here's where the story gets interesting. Wadjet wasn't some minor local deity worshipped by a handful of marsh dwellers. She was the supreme goddess of Lower Egypt, the northern kingdom that controlled the mouth of the Nile. Her city, Wadjet, later called Buto by the Greeks, was one of the most important religious centers in prehistoric Egypt. Her temple housed an oracle that may have been the very source of the oracular traditions that later spread to Greece. Think about that for a moment. The Greeks, whom we credit with founding Western philosophy and democracy, may have learned their most sacred practices from a serpent goddess in the Egyptian marshes. Now you might be wondering why a serpent? Why did this foundational goddess take the form of a cobra? The answer lies in understanding the primal power that serpents represented to ancient peoples. The cobra wasn't just any snake. It was the Uraeus, the rearing cobra, whose very name derives from a word meaning to rise up or to ascend. This serpent fire represented both magical protection and the burning pain of divine justice. When Wadjet reared up from the papyrus marshes, she wasn't just a local swamp deity. She was the embodiment of rising power, of ascension, of the divine feminine principle that could both nurture and destroy. Her venom could kill, but her presence could also heal. Her fire could burn enemies to ash, but her wisdom could illuminate the path to enlightenment. The Uraeus became the most sacred symbol in all of Egypt. Every pharaoh wore it on their crown, not as a mere ornament, but as acknowledgement that their power derived from Wadjet herself. The serpent on the royal diadem was literally the goddess watching over the ruler, legitimizing their authority through her divine presence. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. The Uraeus wasn't just a symbol, it was a contract, a reminder that earthly power came from divine feminine source, and that source was Wadjet. As Egypt evolved from scattered marsh communities into a unified kingdom, something remarkable happened. Wadjet didn't fade into obscurity like so many other local deities. Instead, her influence expanded. When Upper and Lower Egypt unified around 3000 BCE, creating the world's first great nation-state, Wadjet became one half of the most powerful divine partnership in Egyptian religion. The unification created the concept of the two ladies, the Nebti, who jointly protected and legitimized the pharaohs. Wadjet, the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt, joined forces with Nekhbet, the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt. Together, they represented the divine feminine authority that made pharaonic rule possible. But even in this partnership, Wadjet's primacy was clear. She was the goddess of the Nile Delta, the richest and most fertile region of Egypt. She controlled the mouth of the river that brought life to the entire civilization. Without her blessing, the pharaohs were nothing more than desert chieftains with delusions of grandeur. The early pharaohs understood this. They didn't just wear the Uraeus as decoration. They built their legitimacy on the foundation Wadjet had established in the marshlands millennia before their dynasties ever existed. Ancient texts reveal something even more extraordinary about Wadjet's role in Egyptian civilization. She wasn't just a protector goddess or a symbol of royal power. She was intimately involved in the creation and nurturing of the divine pharaonic bloodline itself. The mythology tells us that Wadjet served as a divine wet nurse, suckling the infant sun god Horus and protecting him from his enemies. But this wasn't just symbolic. Archaeological evidence suggests that Wadjet's priestesses may have actually served as ritual nurses for pharaonic children, ensuring that the divine bloodline remained connected to its serpentine source. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, archaeologists discovered a pendant showing the young king being nursed by Wadjet herself. But here's the remarkable detail. Tutankhamun is depicted as a fully grown adult, dressed in his royal regalia, while still being breastfed by the goddess. This isn't infantile imagery. It's a profound statement about the source of pharaonic power. The king, no matter how mighty, remained dependent on the divine feminine nourishment provided by the serpent goddess. His authority flowed not from his own masculine strength, but from the life-giving power of Wadjet. This image appears again and again in royal art and architecture. In the funerary temple of King Pepi II, damaged reliefs show Wadjet nursing the pharaoh. The pyramid texts describe the two ladies maintaining the king's divinity through suckling while he remains in a childlike state of dependence. What emerges from these depictions is a clear picture. The pharaohs weren't independent rulers deriving their authority from military conquest or political maneuvering. They were spiritual children of the serpent goddess, forever dependent on her divine milk for their legitimacy and power. But as Egyptian civilization evolved and became increasingly militaristic and patriarchal, this dependence on feminine divine authority became problematic for the ruling class. How could mighty pharaohs, conquerors of nations and builders of monuments, acknowledge that their power ultimately derived from a goddess dwelling in the marshes? The answer was a slow, systematic campaign to diminish Wadjet's role while maintaining her symbolic presence. The Uraeus remained on the royal crown, but the stories of Wadjet's primacy began to fade from official accounts. Her role as creator of the papyrus and architect of civilization was gradually transferred to male deities like Atum and Ra. This wasn't an overnight transformation. It took centuries of careful mythological manipulation. Scribes began attributing Wadjet's creative acts to her father, Atum. Her wisdom became Ra's wisdom. Her protective fire became the Eye of Ra, rather than the fire of Wadjet herself. The goddess who had once stood alone as the founder of Egyptian civilization was slowly transformed into an appendage of male solar deities. Her independence was erased, her primacy forgotten, her foundational role in Egyptian history relegated to footnotes in religious texts. Yet despite this systematic erasure, traces of Wadjet's true power remained embedded in Egyptian culture. The Uraeus continued to legitimize pharaonic rule. Her oracle at Buto continued to attract pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world. Her festivals continued to draw massive crowds who remembered, even if they couldn't articulate it, that she represented something more fundamental than the male deities who had claimed her achievements. The real evidence of Wadjet's foundational role lies not in the official histories written by pharaonic scribes, but in the archaeological record itself. The earliest depictions of divine authority in prehistoric Egypt show the cobra goddess, not male solar deities. The oldest religious sites in the Nile Delta were dedicated to her worship. The most ancient symbols of Egyptian kingship derive from her serpentine iconography. When we strip away the layers of patriarchal revision and look at the raw archaeological evidence, a stunning truth emerges. Wadjet wasn't just another goddess in the Egyptian pantheon. She was the goddess, the primordial feminine principle from whom all earthly and divine authority ultimately derived. The pharaohs knew this. Their priests knew this. The people knew this. But as Egypt became an empire, as its armies marched across foreign lands and its monuments proclaimed the glory of god-kings, acknowledging dependence on a marsh-dwelling serpent goddess became increasingly inconvenient. So they began the process of forgetting. Not erasing entirely, for that would have been impossible and dangerous. The Uraeus remained because removing it would have delegitimized pharaonic rule entirely. But they transformed Wadjet from an independent creative force into a dutiful servant of male deities. This transformation reveals something profound about how history gets written and rewritten. The stories we inherit aren't neutral accounts of what happened. They're carefully constructed narratives that serve the interests of those in power. When those interests change, the stories change too. Wadjet's gradual disappearance from Egyptian historical consciousness wasn't an accident or a natural evolution of religious thought. It was a deliberate campaign to obscure the feminine foundations of Egyptian civilization and replace them with masculine narratives that better served the interests of an increasingly patriarchal ruling class. But the serpent goddess left traces that couldn't be erased. In the cobra coiled around every pharaoh's crown, in the protective fire that burned in temple sanctuaries, in the ancient wisdom that flowed through Egyptian culture like the Nile itself, nourishing civilization with knowledge that predated all the dynasties and would outlast them all. The question we must ask ourselves is this: what other foundational truths have been systematically erased from our understanding of history? What other divine feminine principles have been transformed into masculine narratives to serve the interests of patriarchal power structures? Wadjet's story is more than just ancient history. It's a template for understanding how civilizations construct and reconstruct their origin stories to serve contemporary political needs. The serpent goddess who founded Egypt didn't disappear because she was no longer relevant. She disappeared because her continued prominence threatened a narrative of masculine dominance that the ruling class needed to maintain their legitimacy. Yet beneath the carefully constructed mythologies of pharaonic propaganda, women continued to rise to power in ways that directly connected them to Wadjet's serpentine legacy. These weren't coincidences or historical anomalies. They were manifestations of the same divine feminine principle that had founded Egyptian civilization in the first place. Consider Neithhotep, whose very name means the goddess Neith is satisfied. She was the wife of Narmer, the legendary first pharaoh who supposedly united Upper and Lower Egypt. But here's what the official histories don't tell you. Neithhotep's tomb is larger than her husband's. Her name appears inside a royal serek, a rectangular frame that was traditionally reserved only for ruling pharaohs. Her burial goods suggest she wielded independent royal power, not just ceremonial authority as a pharaoh's wife. The archaeological evidence points to something extraordinary. Neithhotep wasn't just the first pharaoh's consort. She was likely Egypt's first female ruler, exercising real political and economic power in her own right. Clay seal impressions show she organized mining expeditions and controlled trade routes, activities that required full royal authority, not mere queenly influence. But her connection to Wadjet goes deeper than political power. Neithhotep's patron goddess was Neith, the ancient warrior and creator deity who was intimately connected to the serpent goddess tradition. In some myths, Neith is described as giving birth to Apophis, the great serpent of chaos, from her own saliva while dwelling in the primordial waters. The divine feminine principle that created both order and chaos, both civilization and the wild forces that threatened it. When Neithotep claimed Neith's protection and patronage, she was tapping into the same serpentine power source that had legitimized Egyptian rule since the dawn of civilization. She wasn't borrowing masculine symbols of authority. She was accessing the original feminine foundation of pharaonic power. Then came Mer-Neith, whose name means beloved of Neith. Like Neithhotep before her, Mer-Neith's name appears in a royal serech, marking her as a true pharaoh rather than a mere queen consort. She ruled after the death of her husband Jet, serving as regent for her young son Den until he came of age. But the evidence suggests she did far more than just keep the throne warm. Mer-Neith's reign marked a period of stability and prosperity that allowed her son Den to become one of the most successful pharaohs of the First Dynasty. She didn't just preserve power for the next male ruler. She strengthened and expanded it, demonstrating the same creative and protective qualities that had made Wadjet the foundation of Egyptian civilization. Her tomb at Abydos contains subsidiary burials of servants and officials, a practice typically associated with powerful pharaohs, not dependent queens. The scale and complexity of her burial arrangements suggest she commanded the same resources and respect accorded to male rulers. More tellingly, her connection to the serpent goddess tradition appears in the iconography surrounding her reign. Seals and inscriptions from her period show increased emphasis on cobra imagery and protective serpent symbolism. The Uraeus becomes more prominent in royal art during her rule, as if acknowledging the return of feminine authority to the throne. But perhaps the most remarkable example of Wadjet's continued influence through female rulers comes from much later in Egyptian history, with Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty. Hatshepsut didn't just rule as a female pharaoh. She deliberately adopted masculine iconography and titles, wearing the false beard and kilt of traditional pharaonic regalia. Yet beneath this masculine facade, her connection to the serpent goddess tradition was unmistakable. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari features extensive cobra imagery and protective serpent symbolism. The Uraeus appears repeatedly in her architectural program, not as mere decoration but as a statement of legitimacy rooted in the most ancient traditions of Egyptian divine authority. Hatshepsut understood something that modern historians often miss. The pharaonic Uraeus wasn't just a symbol of royal power. It was a direct connection to Wadjet's founding authority. By emphasizing serpent imagery in her monuments and iconography, Hatshepsut was claiming legitimacy not through masculine conquest or political maneuvering, but through the original feminine principle that had created Egyptian civilization. This is why her successors worked so hard to erase her legacy. It wasn't just that she was a successful female ruler in a patriarchal society. It was that her success demonstrated the continued vitality of the serpentine feminine principle that the male-dominated priesthood and royal court had spent centuries trying to suppress. The systematic destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments and the erasure of her name from official records wasn't random vandalism. It was a continuation of the same campaign that had gradually diminished Wadjet's role in Egyptian mythology. Both the serpent goddess and the female pharaoh represented threats to a patriarchal narrative that claimed masculine authority was natural and divinely ordained. But the pattern extends beyond individual female rulers to the very structure of Egyptian religious and political life. Throughout Egyptian history, periods of female ascendancy coincided with renewed emphasis on serpent symbolism and cobra imagery in royal art and architecture. This wasn't coincidental. It reflected the deep cultural understanding that feminine authority in Egypt drew its legitimacy from the same primordial source that had founded the civilization. Even Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, understood this connection. Her famous asp, the cobra that supposedly killed her, wasn't just a dramatic suicide method. It was a final assertion of her connection to Wadjet's serpentine tradition. By dying through the bite of the sacred cobra, Cleopatra was making a theological statement about the source of her authority and the nature of legitimate rule in Egypt. The asp that killed Cleopatra was the same Uraeus that had crowned every legitimate pharaoh since the unification of Egypt. In death, she was returning to the Serpent Goddess, who had made pharaonic rule possible in the first place. This pattern reveals something profound about the relationship between gender and power in ancient Egypt. Female rulers weren't anomalies or exceptions to normal political structures. They were manifestations of the foundational feminine principle that had created those structures. When women rose to pharaonic power, they weren't breaking with Egyptian tradition. They were returning to it. The male pharaohs who dominated most of Egyptian history were the real innovators, the ones who had to constantly justify their authority through reference to conquered territories, built monuments, and military victories. Female pharaohs could simply point to the Uraeus on their crowns and claim direct descent from the goddess who had created the very concept of pharaonic legitimacy. This is why the systematic erasure of both Wadjet's primacy and female pharaonic achievements required such sustained effort. It wasn't enough to simply ignore them or let them fade from memory. The patriarchal revision of Egyptian history required active suppression because the alternative narrative was so compelling and well documented. Archaeological evidence continuously supports the serpentine feminine foundation of Egyptian civilization. The oldest religious sites are dedicated to cobra goddesses. The earliest royal iconography features serpent imagery. The most ancient legitimizing symbols derive from the Uraeus tradition. Female rulers appear throughout Egyptian history with remarkable consistency, often during crucial transitional periods when strong leadership was essential for civilizational survival. Yet the official histories, written by male scribes serving patriarchal pharaohs, present a different story. A story of masculine conquest and male divine authority. A story in which serpent goddesses serve male solar deities and female rulers are temporary anomalies rather than expressions of foundational principles. The question becomes, which story do we believe? The archaeological record that shows consistent patterns of feminine divine authority and female political leadership, or the written accounts produced by a system that had clear incentives to minimize and erase those patterns? The answer reveals something crucial about how we understand not just ancient Egypt, but the entire process by which historical narratives get constructed. The stories that survive aren't necessarily the most accurate ones. They're the ones that best serve the interests of those who control the mechanisms of historical preservation. Wadjet's gradual disappearance from Egyptian consciousness wasn't a natural evolution of religious thought. It was the result of deliberate choices made by scribes, priests, and pharaohs who found her primacy inconvenient for their political and theological agendas. The same forces that transformed the creator goddess into a servant of male deities also worked to present female pharaohs as temporary exceptions rather than expressions of legitimate authority. Both campaigns served the same purpose: establishing masculine rule as natural and divinely ordained while obscuring the feminine foundations that made that rule possible. But serpents are patient creatures. They can remain hidden for long periods, waiting for the right moment to emerge from their hiding places. Wadjet's legacy survived the systematic attempts at erasure because it was embedded too deeply in Egyptian culture to be completely removed. Every Uraeus that crowned a pharaoh's head was a reminder of her foundational authority. Every cobra temple that continued to attract worshippers was a testament to her enduring power. Every female ruler who rose to the throne was a manifestation of the same serpentine principle that had created Egyptian civilization in the first place. The serpent goddess didn't disappear from Egyptian history. She went underground, coiling through the hidden spaces of cultural memory, waiting for archaeologists and historians brave enough to dig beneath the official narratives and uncover the truth that had been deliberately buried. Today, as we piece together the fragments of evidence that survived the ancient campaign of erasure, Wadjet's true story begins to emerge from the shadows. not as a minor deity in a pantheon dominated by male gods, but as the foundational feminine principle whose creative power made Egyptian civilization possible. The implications extend far beyond ancient history. If the foundational narrative of one of humanity's greatest civilizations has been systematically distorted to serve patriarchal interests, what other historical truths have been similarly obscured? How many other foundational feminine figures have been erased from our understanding of human development? The pattern of erasure extends far beyond Egypt's borders, revealing a systematic global campaign to obscure feminine divine authority that shaped the ancient world. What we discover when we follow the serpent's trail across continents is both remarkable and disturbing. The same cobra symbolism that legitimized Egyptian pharaohs appears in cultures that supposedly had no contact with the Nile Delta. In ancient Mesopotamia, the goddess Tiamat takes the form of a primordial serpent who births the first gods from her watery depths. In Greece, the oracle at Delphi sits above a chasm guarded by the python, a great serpent whose wisdom predates Apollo's arrival. In India, the Nagas are serpent deities who control the waters and guard the treasures of wisdom. Across the Celtic lands, serpent goddesses govern fertility and renewal. These aren't coincidences. They're fragments of a much older global tradition that recognized serpentine feminine divinity as the source of civilizational authority, a tradition that was systematically suppressed as patriarchal warrior cultures spread across the ancient world, replacing goddess-centered societies with male-dominated pantheons. But here's where the Egyptian evidence becomes crucial. Unlike other ancient cultures where the serpent goddess traditions were completely destroyed, Egypt preserved just enough traces for us to reconstruct what was lost. The Uraeus survived because removing it would have delegitimized pharaonic rule entirely. The temple records survived because destroying them would have erased the legal foundations of royal authority. The archaeological evidence survived because it was buried too deeply to be found and destroyed by ancient revisionist campaigns. Egypt became, inadvertently, the repository of evidence for a much larger historical truth about the feminine foundations of human civilization. What they tried to hide in the Nile Delta was actually a window into what had been erased everywhere else. Consider the implications. If Wadjet's story is accurate, if the serpent goddess really did found Egyptian civilization and her role was systematically diminished over centuries of patriarchal revision, then we're looking at evidence of the world's first large-scale historical cover-up, a deliberate campaign to rewrite the origins of human civilization itself. The technology for such a campaign existed in ancient Egypt. The same scribal schools that produced the great literary works also had the capacity to revise historical records. The same priesthoods that maintained temple libraries could decide which texts to preserve and which to allow to crumble. The same royal workshops that carved monuments could choose which images to create and which to destroy. Most importantly, they had the motivation. As Egypt evolved from a collection of marsh communities into a militaristic empire, acknowledging dependence on a feminine swamp deity became increasingly problematic. How could pharaohs who commanded vast armies and built monuments visible from space admit that their authority ultimately derived from a cobra dwelling in papyrus reeds? The solution was elegant and terrifying in its thoroughness. Don't erase Wadjet entirely, because that would create dangerous gaps in the legitimacy structure. Instead, gradually transform her from an independent creative force into a subsidiary aspect of male solar deities. Maintain her symbolic presence while stripping away her autonomous authority. This process took centuries to complete, which explains why we still find traces of her original role scattered throughout Egyptian religious texts. The revisionist campaign was thorough, but not perfect. Enough fragments survived for modern archaeologists to reconstruct the original narrative. But the Egyptian evidence reveals something even more disturbing about this ancient cover-up. It wasn't just about suppressing one goddess or diminishing feminine authority in one culture. It was part of a broader transformation in how human societies understood the relationship between gender and power. Before the patriarchal revisions, power in Egypt flowed from feminine sources to masculine expressions. Wadjet created the foundational authority that pharaohs channeled through their rule. The goddess was the source. The pharaoh was the conduit. This created a balanced system where masculine political power remained accountable to feminine divine authority. After the revisions, this relationship was inverted. Male deities became the sources of power, while feminine figures were reduced to servants, consorts, or aspects of masculine divinity. The pharaoh's authority no longer derived from the serpent goddess, but from his own divine masculine nature. This eliminated the accountability structure that had previously constrained royal power. The transformation wasn't just theological. It had profound political implications. When pharaohs could claim direct divine authority rather than channeled feminine power, they became accountable only to themselves and their male patron deities. The serpent goddess, who had once constrained royal excess through her moral authority, was reduced to a decorative symbol with no independent voice. This pattern appears across multiple ancient civilizations during roughly the same historical period. The great goddess cultures of old Europe gave way to Indo-European warrior societies. The matrilineal Minoan civilization was conquered by patriarchal Mycenaean Greeks. The goddess-centered Indus Valley civilization collapsed and was replaced by Vedic culture with its masculine sky gods. Egypt's evidence suggests these weren't random cultural transitions, but coordinated campaigns to restructure the relationship between gender and authority across the ancient world. The systematic nature of Wadjet's erasure provides a template for understanding how similar erasures might have occurred in other cultures. But the Egyptian serpent goddess left us more than just traces of an ancient cover-up. She left us a methodology for uncovering historical truths that powerful interests wanted to suppress. By studying how Wadjet's role was gradually diminished while her symbolic presence was maintained, we can develop techniques for identifying similar patterns of erasure in other historical contexts. Look for symbols that persist while their original meanings are forgotten. Examine female figures who are described as subsidiaries of male authorities, but whose archaeological evidence suggests independent power. Study religious and political transitions that coincide with the suppression of feminine divine imagery. Trace the linguistic evolution of goddess names and titles to see how they were gradually masculinized or diminished. These techniques, developed through studying Wadjet's erasure, can be applied to historical mysteries far beyond ancient Egypt. They provide tools for recovering lost narratives and suppressed truths from cultures around the world. The serpent goddess also offers us insight into why such erasures occur and how they're maintained across generations. The campaign against Wadjet wasn't motivated by simple misogyny, though gender certainly played a crucial role. It was motivated by the need to legitimize new forms of political authority that couldn't coexist with the old accountability structures. When pharaohs wanted to claim unlimited divine authority, they couldn't simultaneously acknowledge dependence on a goddess who might constrain their actions through moral guidance. When military expansion required absolute royal command, the serpentine tradition of balanced power became an obstacle to be overcome. The erasure of feminine divine authority wasn't an end in itself, but a means to an end. The goal was restructuring political power to serve imperial ambitions that required unprecedented concentrations of authority in individual rulers. This explains why the campaign was so systematic and sustained. It wasn't enough to simply ignore Wadjet or allow her worship to fade naturally. The new political order required active suppression of alternative authority structures that might challenge royal prerogatives. But serpents are survivors. They can shed their skins and emerge renewed. They can hibernate through hostile conditions and return when circumstances improve. They can strike quickly when threatened or retreat silently into hiding. Wadjet's legacy survived the ancient erasure campaign because serpentine wisdom is patient and persistent. The cobra goddess understood that truth has its own momentum, that evidence leaves traces even when deliberately suppressed, that authentic power has deeper roots than political convenience. The Uraeus that crowned every pharaoh's head became a constant reminder of suppressed truth. Every time a ruler placed the cobra symbol on his brow, he was acknowledging, however unconsciously, the feminine source of his authority. Every time the golden serpent caught the sunlight and blazed above the royal forehead, it was Wadjet asserting her continued presence despite centuries of theological marginalization. The female pharaohs who periodically rose to power throughout Egyptian history weren't historical anomalies. They were manifestations of the same serpentine principle that had founded Egyptian civilization, erupting through the carefully constructed patriarchal narratives like cobras striking through desert sand, Neithotep, Mernith, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, Taosret, Cleopatra. These weren't isolated cases of exceptional women overcoming systemic oppression. They were expressions of a foundational feminine authority that could never be completely suppressed because it was embedded too deeply in the civilizational structure itself. Each female pharaoh who took the throne was Wadjet returning, the serpent goddess reclaiming her rightful place as the source of legitimate authority in Egypt. This is why their reigns often coincided with periods of stability, prosperity, and cultural flowering. They weren't fighting against Egyptian tradition. They were returning to it. And this is why their successors worked so hard to erase their achievements. Male pharaohs who followed successful female rulers faced an uncomfortable truth. The women had often governed more effectively by drawing on the original serpentine wisdom that patriarchal ideology had taught them to suppress. The systematic destruction of Hatshepsut's monuments wasn't just masculine insecurity. It was recognition that her success undermined the entire ideological foundation of patriarchal pharaonic rule. If a female ruler could govern effectively by embracing rather than suppressing feminine divine authority, what did that say about the masculine kings who had spent centuries distancing themselves from their serpentine foundations? The same fear that had motivated the original campaign against Wadjet continued to drive the erasure of successful female pharaohs throughout Egyptian history. Both threatened the same patriarchal narrative about the natural superiority of masculine authority. But the evidence survived because truth has its own power. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the extent of female pharaonic achievements and the systematic nature of their erasure. DNA analysis reveals the prominence of royal women in Egyptian dynastic succession. Linguistic studies show how feminine divine titles were gradually transferred to masculine deities. Most importantly, the symbols survived. The Uraeus continues to fascinate modern observers precisely because it carries echoes of suppressed truths. The cobra coiled around the pharaoh's crown speaks to something deeper than decorative tradition. It whispers of ancient wisdom about the relationship between power and gender that our own culture is only beginning to rediscover. Wadjet's story resonates today because we're living through our own version of the same historical dynamics that shaped ancient Egypt. Contemporary debates about gender and authority, about the sources of legitimate power, about the relationship between traditional wisdom and modern innovation, all echo the ancient struggle between the serpent goddess and her patriarchal suppressors. The questions Wadjet's erasure raises are as relevant now as they were 4,000 years ago. Who gets to write history? Which stories serve whose interests? How do power structures maintain themselves by controlling narratives about the past? What truths are we forgetting today that future archaeologists might have to rediscover from fragments and traces? The Serpent Goddess offers us more than just insight into ancient Egyptian politics. She provides a lens for examining how historical narratives get constructed and maintained across cultures and centuries. Her story becomes a key for unlocking similar patterns of suppression and erasure throughout human history. When we learn to read the signs Wadjet left behind, we develop the ability to identify other historical cover-ups, other suppressed truths, other foundational narratives that have been systematically obscured to serve contemporary political interests. The cobra coiled around the pharaoh's crown becomes a symbol not just of ancient Egyptian authority, but of all the hidden truths that survive despite systematic campaigns to erase them. It reminds us that evidence leaves traces, that symbols carry memories, that authentic power has deeper roots than political convenience. Wadjet's legacy challenges us to question the official narratives we've inherited about the past, and to look for the suppressed alternatives that might offer different insights into human potential and possibility. The serpent goddess who founded Egypt and whose memory they tried to bury forever continues to rise from the depths of archaeological discovery, coiling around our understanding of history itself. Her fire still burns in the questions she forces us to ask. Her wisdom still flows through the evidence she preserved despite centuries of suppression. Her power still manifests in the female leaders who continue to rise throughout history, drawing on the same serpentine sources of authority that she established in the primordial marshes of the Nile Delta. The goddess they tried to forget refuses to be forgotten. The truth they buried continues to emerge. The serpent strikes again. But the erasure of Wadjet reveals something even more sinister about how civilizations rewrite their own origins. The campaign wasn't just about diminishing one goddess or restructuring religious hierarchies. It was about fundamentally altering humanity's understanding of where power comes from and who has the right to wield it. In the deepest layers of Egyptian archaeological sites, before the Great Pyramids, before the Pharaonic dynasties, before the unified kingdom that we recognize as ancient Egypt, we find something extraordinary. Pottery shards bearing serpent imagery that predates any known royal iconography. Clay figurines of cobra goddesses that were already ancient when the first pharaohs claimed their thrones. Ritual objects dedicated to Wadjet that show continuous use across millennia, long before and after the official pantheon relegated her to subsidiary status. These artifacts tell a story that contradicts everything we've been taught about the linear progression of human civilization. They suggest that the sophisticated understanding of divine feminine authority, the complex theological frameworks, the intricate symbolic systems we associate with classical Egyptian religion didn't develop gradually over centuries. They were already fully formed in prehistoric times, centered around the serpent goddess, who would later be systematically marginalized. What we're looking at isn't the slow evolution of religious thought. We're looking at the deliberate devolution of an advanced spiritual and political system that recognized feminine divine authority as the foundation of legitimate governance. The implications are staggering. If Wadjet's worship was already sophisticated and widespread before the first pharaohs, then Egyptian civilization didn't begin with masculine conquest and unification. It began with feminine wisdom and organic development under the guidance of the serpent goddess. The pharaohs didn't create Egyptian greatness. They inherited it from a goddess-centered culture and then spent centuries obscuring that inheritance. This radically changes how we understand the relationship between gender and civilization itself. The narrative we've inherited suggests that complex societies naturally develop masculine leadership structures, with feminine authority relegated to domestic or ceremonial roles. But the Egyptian evidence suggests the opposite. Advanced civilization emerged from feminine divine guidance, and masculine political structures were later innovations that required systematic suppression of their foundational sources. The pre-dynastic archaeological record shows something remarkable. Communities organized around Wadjet's temples displayed sophisticated irrigation systems, advanced metallurgy, complex astronomical knowledge, and extensive trade networks. These weren't primitive villages waiting for pharaohs to bring them civilization. These were already civilized societies operating under the guidance of serpent goddess wisdom. When the first pharaohs unified Egypt, they weren't creating civilization, they were conquering it. They were taking control of existing sophisticated systems and gradually restructuring them to serve centralized masculine authority rather than distributed feminine wisdom. This explains why the pharaonic system required such elaborate legitimacy rituals. The Uraeus wasn't just decoration. It was proof that the pharaohs derived their authority from the goddess they had displaced. Every coronation ceremony was essentially an acknowledgement that masculine political power required feminine divine authorization to be legitimate. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. As the pharaonic system consolidated power, it didn't just suppress Wadjet's role in Egyptian religion. It began exporting its revised mythology to other cultures, spreading the narrative of masculine divine supremacy far beyond Egypt's borders. Egyptian traders, diplomats, and military expeditions carried with them not just goods and technologies, but theological concepts that positioned male solar deities as supreme creators and reduced serpent goddesses to subsidiary roles. The same scribal schools that had rewritten Egyptian religious texts began producing works that influenced religious development across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. What started as a localized campaign to legitimize pharaonic authority became a civilizational transformation that reshaped how human societies understood the relationship between gender and divine power. The erasure of Wadjet wasn't just template for an Egyptian phenomenon. It was the much larger historical process that affected cultures across the ancient world. Greek mythology shows clear traces of this Egyptian influence. The great serpent Python, who guarded the oracle at Delphi, is described as feminine in the earliest sources, but later traditions masculinize the creature or subordinate it to Apollo's authority. The same pattern appears in the transformation of the Minoan snake goddess into subsidiary aspects of masculine Olympian deities. In Mesopotamian traditions, the primordial serpent goddess Tiamat is gradually transformed from a creative force into a chaotic enemy that must be defeated by masculine order. The same theological revision that had marginalized Wadjet in Egypt appears in Babylonian creation myths that position male sky gods as supreme authorities who must conquer feminine serpentine chaos. The pattern repeats across cultures that came into contact with Egyptian religious and political ideas. Serpent goddesses who had once been recognized as foundational creative forces became either demons to be defeated or servants of masculine deities. The systematic nature of this transformation suggests coordinated ideological influence rather than independent cultural evolution. But the Egyptian evidence provides the key to understanding this larger process because it preserves traces of what came before the revision. Unlike other cultures where serpent goddess traditions were more completely suppressed, Egypt maintained just enough of Wadjet's original role for modern archaeologists to reconstruct the pre-patriarchal religious framework. What emerges from this reconstruction is a picture of ancient religious life that contradicts fundamental assumptions about human social development. Rather, this revelation forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about the trajectory of human development. The standard narrative suggests that civilization progresses from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated, from feminine to masculine authority structures. But the Egyptian evidence suggests we might have the entire sequence backwards. What if the sophisticated goddess cultures represented the peak of ancient achievement? And what we call the rise of civilization was actually the beginning of a long decline from more advanced spiritual and social systems? What if the patriarchal warrior cultures that conquered the ancient world weren't bringing progress but imposing regression? The systematic suppression of Wadjet's role in Egyptian civilization becomes, in this context, not just a local political maneuver, but a turning point in human history. The moment when advanced spiritual wisdom was subordinated to political expedience. When the serpent goddess who had guided the development of sophisticated civilization was reduced to a decorative symbol serving masculine ambition. But Wadjet's legacy suggests that the suppressed wisdom didn't disappear entirely. It went underground, preserved in symbols and traditions that carried forward the memory of what had been lost. The Uraeus that crowned every pharaoh became a time capsule, preserving traces of the original goddess-centered authority structure even as it was publicly denied. The female pharaohs who periodically rose to power throughout Egyptian history weren't anomalies. They were temporary returns of the original system, moments when the serpentine wisdom broke through the patriarchal overlay and reasserted its foundational authority. Their consistent success in governance wasn't coincidental. They were drawing on the same sophisticated understanding of power and responsibility that had originally built Egyptian civilization. This explains why their reigns were so systematically erased by their successors. It wasn't just masculine insecurity. It was recognition that successful feminine leadership undermined the entire ideological foundation of the patriarchal revision. If women could govern more effectively by embracing rather than suppressing the original serpent goddess wisdom, what did that say about the masculine rulers who had spent centuries distancing themselves from those foundations? The archaeological evidence continues to support this interpretation. Sites associated with female pharaohs consistently show advanced engineering, sophisticated artistic achievement, and evidence of economic prosperity. The systematic destruction of their monuments required enormous resources and sustained effort, suggesting that their successors saw them as existential threats rather than mere political rivals. But the most compelling evidence comes from the traditions that survived the suppression campaigns. Folk practices that maintained serpent goddess worship despite official discouragement. Mystery schools that preserved esoteric knowledge about feminine divine authority. Healing traditions that recognized the therapeutic power of serpent symbolism. These underground currents carried forward the memory of Wadjet's original role, even as official religion relegated her to subsidiary status. They suggest that the suppression was never complete, that the original wisdom continued to flow beneath the surface of patriarchal civilization like an underground river. The serpent wisdom that surfaces in later traditions isn't newly developed. It's ancient knowledge that was driven underground and is now re-emerging. This pattern extends beyond religious traditions into political and social movements throughout history. The consistent appearance of powerful female leaders who draw inspiration from serpentine symbolism isn't coincidental. It represents the persistent influence of the same foundational wisdom that Wadjet embodied in ancient Egypt. From Boudica's Celtic serpent goddess traditions to Joan of Arc's divine visions, from the snake-crowned queens of medieval Europe to the serpent symbolism in modern feminist movements, we see the continuous manifestation of the same archetypal energy that the ancient Egyptians tried to suppress. The goddess who founded civilization refuses to be forgotten. Her wisdom continues to surface wherever human societies face crises that require the kind of sophisticated understanding of power and responsibility that characterized the original goddess-centered cultures. But recognizing this pattern requires us to fundamentally revise our understanding of history itself. We have to acknowledge that the official narratives we've inherited may not just be incomplete, but actively misleading. That the stories we've been told about the natural progression from primitive to advanced, from feminine to masculine authority structures, may be propaganda designed to legitimize systems that actually represent devolution rather than evolution. The serpent goddess challenges us to consider that the ancient world may have been more advanced than we imagine, and that what we call progress may sometimes be disguised regression. That the suppression of feminine divine wisdom represented a loss rather than a gain for human civilization. Wadjet's story becomes a key for unlocking this alternative understanding of history. But the story of intellectual appropriation reveals an even darker dimension when we examine how the stolen knowledge was weaponized against its original sources. The pharaonic system didn't just steal serpent goddess wisdom. It turned that wisdom into tools for suppressing the very traditions that had created it. Mathematical knowledge that Wadjet's followers had developed for temple construction and astronomical observation was redirected toward building monuments that celebrated masculine rather than feminine divine authority. Engineering techniques that goddess-centered communities had created for irrigation and agriculture were applied to constructing military fortifications and royal palaces that served to consolidate patriarchal power. Even the writing system that preserved serpent goddess wisdom was transformed into an instrument of suppression. The same hieroglyphic symbols that had originally recorded feminine divine teachings were used to inscribe laws and proclamations that restricted women's roles and diminished goddess worship. The very medium that had enabled the preservation of ancient wisdom became a weapon against the traditions that had created it. This weaponization of appropriated knowledge represents perhaps the most cynical aspect of the entire suppression campaign. Not only did the pharaonic system steal intellectual achievements from their original sources, it deliberately turned those achievements against the communities that had developed them. The Serpent Goddess's own gifts were transformed into chains that bound her followers and monuments that celebrated her suppression. Archaeological evidence reveals the systematic nature of this weaponization process. Construction projects that utilized goddess-centered engineering knowledge were deliberately designed to overshadow and marginalize serpent goddess temples. Royal monuments built with appropriated mathematical principles were positioned to block sight lines to ancient goddess sites, literally erasing them from the landscape. The psychological impact must have been devastating for communities that saw their own innovations being used to suppress their traditions. Imagine watching techniques your ancestors had developed to honor the serpent goddess being applied to build monuments that denied her authority and celebrated her replacement by masculine deities. But this weaponization strategy ultimately backfired because it created visible evidence of the appropriation process. When modern archaeologists examine pharaonic construction projects, they can identify the goddess-centered techniques that were used despite official claims about masculine innovation. The stolen knowledge carries within it the signature of its origins, revealing the truth about its sources even when official records deny those connections. The irony is profound. By using appropriated serpent goddess wisdom so extensively, the pharaonic system inadvertently preserved evidence of her foundational role in Egyptian civilization. Every pyramid built with stolen mathematical knowledge, every temple constructed using appropriated engineering techniques, every monument positioned according to astronomical calculations originally developed by goddess-centered communities became testimony to Wadjet's continuing influence despite official attempts to suppress her legacy. The weaponization of appropriated knowledge also reveals the essential insecurity of patriarchal power structures. If masculine authority were truly natural and divinely ordained, it wouldn't require such systematic suppression of alternative sources of wisdom and innovation. The very intensity of the appropriation campaign demonstrates how threatened the pharaonic system felt by the continuing vitality of goddess-centered traditions. This insecurity appears throughout the archaeological record in ways that official histories tried to conceal. Royal inscriptions that claim masculine innovations often include defensive language that suggests awareness of competing claims. Pharaonic monuments frequently incorporate symbolic elements designed to counter goddess imagery, revealing ongoing anxiety about serpent goddess influence. Most tellingly, the appropriation campaigns intensified during periods when pharaonic authority was actually weakest. The most systematic suppression of goddess traditions coincided with political instability, economic crisis, and military defeats that undermined confidence in masculine royal leadership. The pharaohs who felt most secure in their power showed less need to suppress serpent goddess worship, while those facing challenges consistently escalated appropriation and suppression efforts. This pattern suggests that intellectual theft and systematic suppression weren't signs of patriarchal strength, but symptoms of patriarchal weakness. The pharaonic system appropriated goddess wisdom precisely because it couldn't generate equivalent innovations through its own methods. It suppressed serpent goddess traditions because it couldn't compete with their continued vitality and relevance. But the weaponization strategy contained inherent limitations that ultimately undermined its effectiveness. Knowledge systems that had developed within integrated spiritual frameworks couldn't function optimally when severed from their sources and redirected toward hostile purposes. The stolen techniques worked, but not as well as they had in their original contexts. Engineering methods that had been refined through generations of goddess-centered innovation became rigid and formulaic when applied within patriarchal hierarchies that didn't understand their underlying principles. Mathematical concepts that had emerged from holistic understanding of natural patterns became isolated procedures that could be followed but not creatively extended. The serpent coils through time, eternal, patient as the river that carved the canyon, relentless as the tide that shapes the shore. Wadjet's fire still burns in every question we dare to ask about the stories we've inherited, every doubt we harbor about the narratives that serve power rather than truth. Her wisdom whispers through the archaeological discoveries that refuse to fit the official timelines, through the symbols that carry meanings deeper than their surface decorations, through the underground currents of knowledge that flow beneath the carefully constructed monuments of patriarchal revision. The goddess they buried beneath centuries of systematic erasure continues to rise, not in vengeance, but in revelation, not to destroy, but to illuminate the paths forward that our ancestors knew before forgetting became a weapon of control. What other truths lie coiled in the shadows of history, waiting for eyes brave enough to see beyond the stories we've been told? The serpent's ancient promise remains: those who seek wisdom will find it. Those who honor truth will be guided by it, and those who remember the source will never truly be lost. The fire of the Uraeus burns eternal, and the goddess who founded civilization continues to found new possibilities for those who remember her name. If these stories stir something in you, please leave a like and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Until next time, sweet dreams, and keep questioning. Good night.